Without objection.
Now, Madam President, first responders at the state, local, and federal levels continue working around the clock, helping the people of East Palestine recover from one of the worst train derailments in decades. The scene in East Palestine over the last month has been the stuff of nightmares. A 38-car derailment, an entire town forced to evacuate, the stench of industrial chemicals and soot hovering in the air, parents scared of their kids' drinking water, and kids anxious about life returning to normal. Now, no community deserves this. While a full investigation of the derailment has yet to be completed, the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board said this accident was, quote, 100% preventable. Again, NTSB Safety Board Chair, the accident was 100% preventable. The fault for this disaster lies first and foremost with Norfolk Southern. Norfolk Southern's CEO, Alan Shaw, needs to come before the Senate, answer questions under oath, and explain to the American people exactly what went wrong and how they will prevent accidents like this from happening. He should not duck. He should be there. He should come before the Senate. And we are asking Mr. Shaw to do just that. The American people should hear from Norfolk Southern's CEO precisely why they thought it was a good idea to spend years lobbying to loosen regulations designed to prevent accidents like this. And I especially want to hear why Norfolk Southern, after seeing a record $3.3 billion in profits last year, prioritized billions in stock buybacks instead of putting that money towards safety and towards their workers. Over the past few weeks, there's been no shortage of opportunists racing to blame the administration for the train derailment. Former President Trump himself showed up in East Palestine and blamed everyone but himself for the tragic accident. But President Trump, as usual, omits a crucial truth. The Trump administration spent years working to loosen safety regulations intended to make these types of accidents less likely. They're in the behest of the big rail companies. When President Trump entered office, rail companies spent millions pushing for repeals on all sorts of safety regulations, from inspection requirements, mandates for newer brakes, and rules governing the number of employees required to operate a train. In one instance, the Trump administration repealed requirements for an electronic braking system because, according to them, the safety benefits were simply not worth the costs. Let me say that again. In 2017, the Trump administration decided to repeal requirements for brake upgrades because they didn't think the safety benefits were worth the cost. I think the people of East Palestine now know that that analysis was wrong and that they're suffering the consequences of rail companies putting profits over people. Now, I want to be clear. A full investigation is still needed to determine which, if any, safety regulations might have prevented the accident in East Palestine. But you don't need to be an expert to see that when companies prioritize profits over safety, when they loosen safety rules, lay off thousands of workers, and spend more money on stock buybacks than in preventing accidents, you're flirting with disaster. It is so typical of Donald Trump. He does the bidding of corporate special interests, and it leads to serious harm to the American people. And when he gets caught, he turns around and blames someone else. It just doesn't wash. The American people see through it. Disasters like the one in East Palestine are precisely what can happen when safety takes a back seat to maximizing profits and when self-aggrandizing politicians like Donald Trump allow and encourage it to happen. Now, I particularly want to thank my colleagues from Ohio and Pennsylvania for being vigilant in responding to this disaster and working in a bipartisan way to solve it. I also, of course, want to thank all the first responders at every level of government for working without rest to keep people safe. The Senate is going to look into precisely what went wrong in East Palestine. A good first step will be hearing directly from Norfolk Southern's CEO. I hope he'll work with us in good faith to come before the Senate as soon as possible. Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
First, some business, and then I'll give my remarks. First, Mr. President, I understand there's a bill at the desk that's due for a second reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for a second time.
S532, a bill to preserve and protect the free choice of individual employees to form, join, or assist labor organizations or to refrain from such activities.
In order to place the bill on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I would object to further proceeding.
Objection having been heard, the bill will be placed on the calendar.
Now, Madam President, on our recap of our CODEL. While meeting last week with leaders in Europe, India, Pakistan, and Israel, the 9 of us on our CODEL, 2 takeaways became clear. First, the United States should deepen our relationship with India if we want to outcompete the Chinese Communist Party in this century. Second, democracies must unite in increasing aid to Ukraine. I was glad Prime Minister Modi got the message during our meeting with him in India. My colleagues and I made clear the two largest democracies in the world's oldest democracy, the world's largest, could be a powerful check against the CCP. That doesn't mean just cooperating with India on defense and security, though that's essential. It means we must take an all-out, all-of-the-above approach, because that's precisely what the CCP is doing. The CCP wants to outcompete America not just on defense, but also economically, geopolitically, technologically, in terms of our fundamental values and more. Just as our transatlantic partnership matters immensely, so too will our partnership with India. The U.S. and India must therefore keep working together to strengthen our economic ties, expand our trade, and make it easier to recruit talented workers from abroad to work in our country. While meeting with foreign leaders, we also made clear the importance of standing shoulder to shoulder with the people of Ukraine. We made it clear to the leaders of Europe, India, Pakistan, and Israel that they must increase their aid to Ukraine. Vladimir Putin's illegal invasion is now a year old, and as difficult as the road has been, we made it clear that the worst thing we can do is waver in our support. The Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian armed forces are fighting valiantly, but they need more material, and it's our job to give it to them. A Russian victory will not quench Putin's hunger for expansion. On the contrary, it would escalate his desire for more territory. So the right answer is for the transatlantic partnership and all free nations of the world to continue supporting the Ukrainian people. Now on the SCOTUS oral arguments on student debt. Today, the Supreme Court begins hearing oral arguments on President Biden's student debt relief plan, a plan that could give tens of millions of Americans a new lease on life. Republicans talk a big game about helping working people, but today's case before the Supreme Court, pushed by Republican office holders who oppose the president's plan, is a slap in the face of working Americans across the country. Young and old alike. Let me be clear. 90% of the relief going to out-of-school borrowers will go to those earning less than $75,000 a year. This isn't a handout to the wealthy, far from it. This is critical relief to working and middle-class families. For generations, higher education was the ladder up into the middle class, especially for millions of Black, Latino, and Asian Americans. But over the years, the student debt that comes with a college degree has become not a ladder up, but an anchor, weighing Americans down, making it harder for them to put a down payment on a house, buy a car, start a family, and save for retirement. In other words, the burden of student debt makes it harder to achieve the American dream. That's what's at stake before the Supreme Court. Not just the chance to relieve the crushing weight of student debt for millions upon millions of people, but also to make the American dream a little more accessible for millions more, their families as well as themselves. That's all we're trying to do, And I'm confident we'll get there because I believe the law is on our side. Now on chips and science. Just 6 months after President Biden signed the CHIPS and Science Act into law, we're already seeing it pay major dividends for our economy, to the tune of $200 billion in private investments across 16 states. And starting today, applications are officially open for more investments in American industry and in American workers. Today, Secretary Raimondo, who's done terrific work getting CHIPS up and running, is rolling out the Department of Commerce's applications for CHIPS funding. Today's rollout's a major step towards making America the world leader in chip production once again, with tremendous benefits for our national security, for outcompeting the Chinese Communist Party, and creating tens of thousands of good-paying union jobs right here at home. So I want to commend Secretary Raimondo, who is not only a crucial partner with me in getting the bill across the finish line, but has also done a fantastic job rolling out the funding so quickly, so effectively, so efficiently. And I want to commend my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for recognizing the need to get this done and pushing to make it happen. And on East Palestine, yesterday I called on Norfolk Southern CEO Alan Shaw to come before the Senate and answer questions under oath about the about the derailment in East Palestine. The accident has been deemed 100% preventable. So Mr. Shaw should be transparent, forthright, and he should not duck, but instead testify before America, before the Senate, as soon as possible. Norfolk Southern owes the American people some answers to some very important questions. Why, for example, did Norfolk Southern spend years pushing the federal government, and particularly the Trump administration, to repeal safety regulations intended to prevent accidents similar to the one in East Palestine? Why has Norfolk Southern laid off thousands of workers while reporting over $3 billion in profits in 2022? And why did Norfolk Southern launch a $10 billion stock buyback program last year, when they could have used that money to upgrade safety equipment, hire more workers, or pay their employees better wages? Disasters like the one in East Palestine are precisely what can happen when safety takes a back seat to maximizing profits. It's a pattern that has played out to devastating effect over the years. Corporate interests lobby the government to loosen safety rules, then they cut costs, cut workers, reward shareholders, and sooner or later, disaster strikes. And it is so typical, Mr. President, for people like Donald Trump to do the bidding of special interests, cause harm to the American people. That's what he did when he loosened railroad regulations, and then point the finger at someone else when something terrible happens. That's just what he did here. It just doesn't wash. The American people see right through it. So once again, I hope the CEO of Norfolk Southern testifies as soon as possible. Norfolk Southern has broken their trust with the American public and must be held accountable. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum. Madam President.
The Senate Majority Leader.
So this Thursday, President Biden will release the third budget proposal of his presidency, one of the most important chances all year to emphasize the contrast between Democrats and Republicans' vision for the country. When Americans see President Biden's budget proposal and compare it to the nasty plans coming from Republicans, the contrast will be glaring and unmistakable. First, President Biden's budget will focus on creating opportunity for average Americans. He'll keep his promise not to raise taxes for anyone making less than $400,000 a year. He will show how Democrats will keep Medicare solvent for another 2 decades. And he'll lay out a plan, a realistic, serious plan, for lowering the deficit by $2 trillion over the next 10 years. Republicans love to talk about cutting the deficit, but Democrats have actually done it. The Inflation Reduction Act lowered the deficit by hundreds of billions of dollars, and we cut the deficit while also cutting prescription drug costs and expanding tax credits for millions of middle-class families. Now compare President Biden's budget to the nasty vision laid out by our Republican friends. While the president's budget will keep taxes and costs low, For the vast majority of families, Republicans went on record wanting to raise taxes by 30% for millions of Americans through their recent national sales tax proposal. While the president promised no new taxes for people making under $400,000, the very first bill House Republicans passed helped rich tax cheats get away with paying little or nothing in taxes. And while President Biden and Democrats have been clear Social Security and Medicare are not on the table, Republicans have proposed raising the retirement age and privatizing certain elements of Medicare. The result, fewer benefits for retirees, higher premiums for Medicare beneficiaries. We cannot overlook the threat Republicans also pose to Medicaid, which tens of millions of middle-class Americans rely on to ease the burden of paying for nursing homes and assisted living. Democrats want to preserve and strengthen Medicaid, but Republican proposals would cut Medicaid by $2.2 trillion and end coverage for millions of Americans. That average middle-class family, let's say they're 40, 50 years old, they're worried about paying for the kids' college, but they also have a parent in a nursing home. Right now, Medicaid would pay for it if the parent doesn't have the resources. These cuts, that burden will fall on tens of millions of American families in the prime of life. Finally, the president will make clear that in order to strengthen Social Security and Medicare and to lower the deficit responsibly, the ultra-rich must pay their fair share. There is no conceivable scenario where wealthy CEOs should ever pay a lower rate than nurses and teachers and firefighters. But that's precisely how Republicans preferred it when they cut taxes for the ultra-rich under Donald Trump. It's as if Republicans care more about making sure the rich stay rich than they do about building ladders to the middle class, than they do about keeping middle-class people in that position. Now, when President Biden called out Republicans for targeting Social Security and Medicare, they erupted with feigned outrage during his State of the Union. But to this day, Speaker McCarthy, House Republican leadership, have failed to present their own plan to the American people. Speaker McCarthy, it's now March 6th. Where is your plan? Speaker McCarthy, where is your plan? The president's about to release his budget. Are you going to release yours anytime soon? Enough with the dodging. Enough with the excuses. Show us your plan. And then show us how it's going to get 218 votes on your side of the aisle. Americans deserve to see for themselves what Democrats and Republicans propose for the future of the country. Republicans should come clean with the American people about what cuts they're pushing and explain how those cuts will cause unnecessary pain for millions of Americans across the country. Now on rail safety. It's a busy time for the Senate as we get to the bottom of what went wrong last month in East Palestine. Last week, my colleagues, Senator Brown, Democrat, Senator Vance, Republican, introduced the Bipartisan Railway Safety Act of 2023. I promised to work with them and with colleagues on both sides to push this bill forward. This Thursday, the Environmental and Public Works Committee, under the able leadership of Chairman Carper, will also hear from Norfolk Southern's CEO, Alan Shaw. I expect a candid, honest, clear-eyed discussion about how we can prevent another East Palestine in the future. And while I'm glad that Norfolk Southern CEO is testifying, we cannot have an open debate, an honest debate in Congress about rail safety unless Republicans acknowledge how they spent years opposing safety rules intended to prevent accidents similar to the one in Ohio. The story of rail safety deregulation over the last decade has been a disturbing tale of Republicans placing profits over people and currying favor with the rail lobby, all at the expense of workers' and family safety. As far back as the Obama administration, Republicans pushed numerous bills to weaken environmental standards, delay safety upgrades, and even prohibit federal funding for Amtrak. Under President Trump's watch, it became easier to transport flammable liquids and hazardous materials without proper oversight. Under President Trump's watch, it also became easier to cut back on staffing requirements while operating a train. And it was the Trump administration that killed proposals to expand electronic brake requirements across the industry. The reason for that delay? The Trump administration thought it was, quote, not economically justified. You can't come up with a better slogan for Republicans' attitude towards rail safety than this: not economically justified. I imagine the message that sends to small towns across America like East Palestine, with rail lines running right through them. I want to be clear. A full investigation into the cause of the East Palestine derailment must be complete before we know the specifics behind the accident. But it doesn't take an expert to see that if you spend years trying to cut back safety regulations, if you spend years doing the bidding of the rail lobby, then in the long run, communities like East Palestine are at greater risk of accident. And so are so many of my communities in upstate New York, where two of the major national rail lines run through the state, one across the center of the state, near where the Erie Canal ran, going through Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Utica, Albany, down the Hudson River, and the other across the southern tier. In fact, now, this weekend, we saw yet another Norfolk Southern derailment in Ohio, near Springfield. Thank God nobody was hurt. So I look forward to hearing from Norfolk Southern CEO this week. I look forward to working with both sides to increase rail safety through legislation. But Republicans need to acknowledge that accidents like the one in East Palestine don't happen out of the blue. They become more likely when maximizing profits is crowned king above everything else, even above people's safety. On the IRS commissioner, today I'm going to file cloture on the nomination of Daniel Werfel to serve as commissioner for the IRS. For the information of all senators, this will set up the first procedural vote on this nominee as early as Wednesday. Mr. Werfel was reported out of the committee with bipartisan support, and it should be no different on the Senate floor. Confirming someone as qualified as Mr. Werfel as IRS commissioner is crucial to making sure Americans take full advantage of all the tax credits we approved last year through legislation like the CHIPS and Science bill. It's also crucial for deploying resources we approved to go after rich cheats and ensure middle-class families are not needlessly audited while those at the top get by scot-free. The Senate has a responsibility to make sure the IRS is fully staffed, to handle its enormous workload, all the more important this year because of the new tax credits we approved through bills like CHIPS and Science last Congress. And finally, on spectrum, Madam President, senators from both sides of the aisle are working to approve a 60-day extension of the FCC's spectrum auction authority by the March 9th deadline. The House recently passed a 60-day extension by voice vote. We are working right now to get the Senate to act quickly in order to give both sides more time to arrive at a larger, comprehensive agreement. Congress has never before allowed the FCC spectrum auction authority to lapse, and to let it happen for the first time would be disastrous. Spectrum is essential for building out 5G capabilities. Its application impacts everything, from families' internet access to satellite communications all the way down to baby monitors. I expect both sides will come to an agreement very soon to approve a 60-day extension before the March 9th deadline. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Next, on the FBI. A few weeks ago, former President Donald Trump called on Republicans in Congress to defund the Department of Justice and FBI because of personal grievances. Instead of standing up to President Trump, Speaker McCarthy and Republican leaders have been silent, and some members of their party even echo the former president's call. That's why today I'm introducing a resolution denouncing President Trump's call to defund the DOJ and the FBI. The Senate will act on this measure as soon as next week. The resolution is simple. It expresses our support for federal law enforcement, and it condemns Donald Trump's call to defund the DOJ and FBI and any other partisan attempts to undermine their authority. When the resolution comes to the floor, every member of this chamber will have a chance to do the right thing. Stand up for the brave law enforcement who keep us safe and reject the former president's dangerous call to strip away their funding. I hope the resolution passes unanimously. It certainly should. The DOJ and FBI do critical work to protect our communities from threats at home and abroad, including drug trafficking, gun violence, terrorism, and so much more. Do Republicans really want to cut their funding? the funding of these agencies, making it harder for them to do their jobs. So again, where will Republicans stand? Will they stand with the federal law enforcement to keep us safe, or stand with the former president and his dangerous call to defund federal law enforcement? The American people deserve to know how radical the hard right has become, and this resolution will give them answers. Mr. President, with June 1st only 21 days away, the most important thing congressional leaders can do to protect the well-being of Americans is to say loud and clear, default is off the table. That is the assurance the President gave 2 days ago when he met with congressional leaders. It is the assurance Leader Jeffries and myself gave that day at the meeting as well. Even Leader McConnell said the U.S. will not default on the national debt. Speaker McCarthy, however, continues on a path to drive the country towards disaster. Instead of taking default off the table, Speaker McCarthy is taking default hostage. Let me say that again, because that sums up what's happening right now. Instead of taking default off the table, Speaker McCarthy is taking default hostage. The strategy of the hard right remains our way or the highway. Either Americans accept devastating cuts to veterans, law enforcement, even cancer research, or the hard right will allow default. What a terrible choice. And that is what makes this default fight uniquely dangerous. The hard right is dominant in the House, and they seem to be ready, seem to be perfectly willing to let the U.S. default. Speaker McCarthy realizes his hard right agenda, as embodied on their default with an Default on America Act, cannot win support from the American people on the merits. So he and the hard right are holding the country hostage to default. And if anyone doubts the hard right is in control, all they have to do is watch last night's CNN town hall, where former President Donald Trump openly called on Republicans to, quote, do a default if they cannot enact their hard right agenda. Never mind that under Donald Trump's watch, Republicans agreed to avoid default 3 times without ever getting hung up about unrelated partisan priorities. And never mind that 25%, a quarter, of the national debt was actually accumulated while President Trump was in office. He is openly calling on his party to destroy the economy if they can't pass their radical agenda. By now, of course, it is old news that Donald Trump is about as qualified to run the country as a broken brick. But the danger here is he holds enormous sway over Speaker McCarthy and the hard right. If Donald Trump says that it's better for the U.S. to default than it is for Republicans to compromise, that unfortunately only makes default more likely. Donald Trump's demands for default would cause tens of millions of Americans to suffer. This isn't difficult. Can we all clearly and unmistakably take default off the table? Will Speaker McCarthy take default off the table? He is the only one of the 5 of us who met at the White House who has not answered that. Speaker McCarthy, will you allow the hard right to keep pulling the strings and push our country off a cliff? Or will you make it clear that no matter what, we will preserve the full faith and credit of the United States? Look, we recognize that Republicans have objections about certain policies, certain spending, certain investments. We do not agree with them. But these discussions are a normal part of the budget process that both sides have engaged in for a long time. This is too important for brinksmanship and reckless ultimatums. White House staff, along with my office, the Speaker's office, Leader McConnell, Leader Jeffries, will continue to meet in an attempt to find a constructive way forward on the budget appropriations priorities. If Speaker McCarthy is willing to state that despite what Trump says, that default is off the table, there can be real progress on the budget. And obviously, as the Speaker of the House, McCarthy will have some real influence in that. But that progress should not and cannot be tied to default. I hope Americans take a moment to listen to the dangerous things President Trump has said last night about default, because he exposed just how unfit MAGA Republicans are for governing and how serious they are about their threats.
Senator Vance just announced he's going to place a hold on all DOJ nominees other than Marshall nominees given the Trump indictment. Can you respond to that? And more broadly, the Republican criticism of the Justice Department has declined to prosecute Hillary Clinton over classified documents, but is prosecuting Donald Trump.
Look, I'd say this. First, I'm not familiar with what Vance said, so I'm not going to comment on it. In terms of the Trump indictment, no one's above the law, including Donald Trump, and there ought to be no political or ideological interference as the case moves forward. Yes. This nice man right here. Yes. Surprise. He's surprised I called on him.
Speaker McCarthy says that he wants to have a debate about restructuring the FBI. Is that a debate the Senate should have as well?
Look, the bottom line is, again, we don't need political interference. We need strong law enforcement, and Donald Trump's not above the law, plain and simple. Yes. Yeah, the bottom line is that I don't think that would have much support in the Senate among Democrats or Republicans.
Senator Schumer.
Yes.
Senator Schumer,
Bolton and then you.
Mike Rounds says that there's no question Trump's indictment is going to create a headwind for Republicans and make it tougher to take back the Senate in 2024. Do you agree with that?
No comment.
House Democrats have put together some discharge petitions on gun-related bills over in the House. You had a conference or conversation with your caucus a couple weeks ago about gun. Are you going to bring any gun-related
Yeah,
bills?
we're having very serious discussions on how the best way forward to move forward on guns is. What they're sending over is just awful. It allows you to conceal what is in effect an assault weapon, and that's been used in many of the killings. The killing in Tennessee, when you can convert a handgun into an assault-like weapon, you can conceal it because you can't see the barrel. That's been used in a good number of the recent killings. When you saw that horrible picture of those poor children going away on the bus where 3 of their 9-year-old classmates had been killed, and you realize it was that gun that did it, it's just appalling that they're doing this. Last one. Last one.
Okay, you have your AI briefing coming up here shortly. What is it that you hope senators take out of this? And Senator Durbin said that he's hopeful but skeptical that there could be some sort of AI legislation.
Look, it's a very difficult issue, but we're off to a very good start. You can't ignore this issue because it's going forward. So it can go forward where we can maximize the benefits and minimize the liabilities, or ignore it. We're not ignoring it. And we have a bipartisan group composed of Senator Rounds, Senator Heinrich, Senator Young, and myself. We've asked our committees to look in all their various jurisdictions at what should be done. This is the first of 3 briefings. So we're making good progress. Is it an easy issue? No. Does it have to be tackled in the best possible way? Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. We'll take the way back there.
Would you keep the Senate in session in August in order to confirm these nominees that Senator Tuberville is holding up?
Look, the bottom line is on 2 points. First, in terms of Tuberville, both McConnell and Thune have disagreed strongly with what Tuberville is doing. It is their responsibility to get him to stop this policy, which is reckless and hurts our national security. In terms of staying, look, our first job is to pass NDAA, and then we'll see what goes from there. Yes?
Mr. Leader, thank you. Really quickly, I just want to get your thoughts. If the former president, do you think the former president should be indicted on charges connected to January 6th? And if he is, are you concerned about security here?
Look, first, no person is above the law, including Donald Trump. We should let the process play out without political or ideological interference. Yes?
Thank you, Leader Schumer. What are red lines for some Democrats as it pertains to the NDA? For example, what amendments that relate to abortion and DEI would that be a red line for some Democrats?
The bottom line is that we want to get this done without amendments that undo the bill, are dilatory in any way. So far, our Republican colleagues are cooperating. Yes?
Leader Schumer, have you had any direct conversations with Senator Tuberville, and do you rule out giving him a standalone vote affirming the DOD's abortion policy?
The bottom line is that if he wants to have an affirmative vote, we would not object to it. Tuberville said he wanted a vote. We'll see what happens. The bottom line is it's up to the Republican leadership. This is a problem that they have in their caucus, that they have with the country. They are risking our security, and it's up to them to fix it. Yes.
Senator Schumer, you've given committee chairs some sort of deadline or timeline for when you'd like them to produce portions of this China competitiveness package that you want to.
Yeah, we are working with them. Some of the committees are far along in the process, some a little less so. But this is something we'd like to put together by the fall. Yes.
What happens next with Julie Su's nomination? You have at least one Democrat against it. The White House says there's two, including Senator Sinema. Will you support her staying in this role through that election without a vote? Will you bring her to the floor?
Look, we believe she is a strong nominee. We're trying to do everything we can to get her passed, plain and simple. Yes, way back there.
Appropriations process in the House, can we get your reaction to them marking up fiscal 22 levels? Will that lead to a government shutdown? Does it have to be at the 22 levels?
Look, the bottom line is that the MAGA hard-right Republicans, the 30 of them or so, shouldn't be dictating policy. And as we learned with debt ceiling, if they dictate policy, America's in big trouble. It's up to the Republican caucus in the House to resist that. Yes. Go ahead.
You attended President Herzog's speech today, but 10 House Republican or 10 House Democrats boycotted that speech, and over the weekend, one of your House Democratic colleagues said that Israel is a racist state. Your response to those comments and the boycott?
Look, the bottom line is I fully and strongly support a strong Israel-America relationship. I'm even wearing my Israel colors suit today. But I've expressed my disagreements directly to Prime Minister Netanyahu. Last one.
Can you talk about your amendment on the UAPs and whether Americans will be able to be guaranteed access to these documents?
Yes. Look, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And there are lots of theories floating around about what has happened with UAPs. We have provided a process, Senator Rounds, myself, Senator Rubio, Senator Heinrich, there are two more, Senator Young, and there's another Democrat. No, is it Gillibrand? Heinrich I named. Well, we'll get you this. Gillibrand, yes. And we think that given proper going through the process so no classified information is revealed, it'll be very helpful for the American people to see exactly what's there, because otherwise there are all sorts of rumors flying around. Thank you, everybody. Now on labor and the UAW and the WGA. Early this morning, on my way before I came to Washington, I went to Rockland County, New York, and stood with UAW Local 3039 on the picket line in solidarity with their fight for better wages, better benefits, safer working conditions. Rain or shine, and today it was mostly rain, UAW Local 3039 is out there, standing for a fair, equitable contract to share in the profits they helped create. We must not forget, during the auto crisis of 2008, unions and workers gave back plenty. It's one of the reasons that the auto companies are making such large profits, and the workers are entitled to have a fair share of those profits. So we need to make sure that this strike is fair to working people. Not this strike, this settlement that the strike will produce is fair to working people. It's simple, Mr. President. When unions win, workers win. The middle class wins. America wins. Just take the WGA strike, the Writers Guild, for example. This past weekend, after nearly 5 months on strike, the WGA announced a tentative settlement with Hollywood studios to get members back to work. The WGA deal proves that progress is possible, that workers can gain, and I hope it encourages the big three auto companies to stay at the table and bargain in good faith. And today, in a milestone for the UAW strike and the history of working people in this country, President Biden traveled to Michigan today to stand with the UAW on the picket line. It's likely to be the first time in 100 years a sitting president joined workers on the picket line. It shows how important strong labor unions are to this president and to Democrats. And that's why I thought it was appropriate for me this morning to join some of our New York UAW members on the picket lines in New York as the president marched in Michigan. President Biden's visit underscores a historic moment for the American labor movement. We may be on track to see the most labor activity in 40 years. And I'm proud that so many of my colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle have stood on the line with workers fighting for a better life. As President Biden said today, the middle class built this country and unions built the middle class. Praise God we have a president as pro-union and pro-worker as President Biden in an office at a time like this. Of course, we weren't always so lucky. Former President Trump will also be in Michigan this week, where he will no doubt try to style himself as a champion of unions and working Americans. That's pretty rich, coming from someone who led one of the most anti-worker administrations in recent memory, one openly hostile to labor unions, disinterested in the well-being of working families, and appointing anti-labor people to many of the agencies that regulate labor. No working American should believe Donald Trump when he claims to fight for them. Where was Donald Trump when UAW went on strike against GM in 2019? All talk, no substance. Even now, he's openly attacking the UAW that is trying to secure better contracts. The difference between the Biden administration's record on labor and the Trump administration's record couldn't be starker. Under the Biden administration, Democrats secured historic relief to protect hard-earned pensions through the American Rescue Plan. Under the Trump administration, on the other hand, Republicans reversed rules to expand overtime pay for 8 million workers, loosened infection and safety rules for oil rigs and coal companies, and reversed bans on toxic pesticides that protected farm workers. Under the Biden administration, Democrats broke the nearly decade-long funding freeze on the National Labor Relations Board. But under the Trump administration, Republicans appointed the most anti-labor NLRB nominees, and they voted to make it harder for workers to organize while making it easier for employers to oust existing unions. Under the Biden administration, we passed historic bills like the infrastructure bill, CHIPS and Science, and the Inflation Reduction, all of which are creating good-paying jobs. And as Majority Leader, I made sure that pro-union provisions were written into this legislation. But under the Trump administration, Republicans passed a $1.5 trillion tax cut that overwhelmingly benefited big corporations and the ultra-wealthy while giving peanuts to working families that Donald Trump claimed to fight for. So it's easy to see who's really on the side of unions and working Americans and who isn't. I was proud to stand with the UAW this morning. I'm proud that President Biden is standing with working people of this country today. I yield the floor.